There is a quiet belief sitting underneath almost every conversation about self-improvement, and it is rarely spoken out loud. It does not feel aggressive. It does not feel cruel. It often feels caring, responsible, even mature. The belief is simply that the present version of oneself is somehow lacking, unfinished, or insufficient, and that there exists a more complete version of oneself somewhere ahead in time. A version that will finally be calmer, more confident, more disciplined, more healed, more awake. Because this belief sounds so reasonable, it rarely gets questioned. In fact, to question it can feel uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. After all, what kind of person wouldn't want to improve? What kind of mind would dare to suggest that striving to be better might itself be part of the tension? And so the assumption stays hidden, working silently in the background, shaping how the mind relates to itself from moment to moment. Once this assumption is accepted, something subtle but profound happens. The mind divides itself. There is the self that exists now, the one having thoughts, emotions, doubts, habits, and there is the imagined self that should exist later. The present self becomes provisional, temporary, a draft, and the future self becomes an internal reference point, a standard constantly hovering just out of reach. Life is no longer happening here. It is happening on the way to somewhere else. This division does not feel dramatic at first. It feels like motivation, like direction, like purpose. But over time, it introduces a quiet tension into every experience. Whatever arises in the present is subtly evaluated against what it says about progress. Calm feels good, not simply because it is calm, but because it suggests advancement. Anxiety feels bad not simply because it is uncomfortable, but because it seems to mean something has gone wrong with the project of becoming better. To see how unusual this is, it helps to look away from the human mind for a moment. Consider something ordinary and non-human. A tree, for instance. A tree grows, adapts, sheds leaves, bends in storms, thickens its trunk over years. But it is never trying to improve itself. It does not wake up dissatisfied with yesterday's growth. It does not carry an internal image of a more evolved tree that it must become. Growth happens, but without self-judgment. Change occurs, but without self-comparison. Or consider a cloud moving across the sky. It forms, dissolves, reforms. It becomes dense, then thin, then disappears entirely. At no point does the cloud experience itself as failing for not holding its shape. There is no anxiety in its transformation, no internal resistance. The cloud does not measure itself against an ideal cloud. When the mind turns back toward itself, however, the tone changes completely. The human mind does not merely experience change, it evaluates it. It does not simply notice patterns, it assigns meaning to them. And once meaning is assigned, identity begins to form around it. The idea of me becomes entangled with stories about improvement, progress, regression, success, and failure. Here a central metaphor quietly emerges. Imagine a mirror that becomes unhappy with what it reflects. Instead of simply showing what appears before it, the mirror starts to interfere. It wants to adjust the image, correct the lighting, smooth out imperfections. But the moment it tries to change the reflection directly, it stops functioning as a mirror. The clarity disappears. The reflection becomes distorted, tense, unstable. Self-improvement often works in exactly this way. Awareness, which naturally observes thoughts, feelings, and sensations, begins to identify with the image it is observing. Once that identification happens, observation turns into correction, noticing turns into managing, and managing turns into conflict. The mind is no longer watching itself. It is fighting itself in the name of becoming better. At first, this internal conflict feels productive. There is energy in dissatisfaction. There is momentum in believing that one can fix oneself. The ego thrives on having a problem to solve, and when no external enemy is available, it very easily turns inward. The present self becomes the obstacle. The future self becomes the promise, and the tension between the two generates endless mental activity. This activity often disguises itself as insight. Thoughts like, "I shouldn't still be feeling this way," or, "If I were truly growing, this wouldn't bother me anymore," sound reflective, even intelligent. But they are built on the same structure. The assumption that what is happening now is unacceptable because it does not match an imagined standard. And each time that assumption is reinforced, identity tightens around it. This tightening is subtle. It does not feel like ego at first. It feels like responsibility, like seriousness, like depth, but rigidity has entered the system. The self is no longer fluid. It becomes an object that must be maintained and improved. And once identity becomes rigid, tension is inevitable. Anxiety does not arrive because something external is wrong. It emerges naturally from the friction between what is and what is supposed to be. You can feel this friction in ordinary moments. Rest becomes uncomfortable because it seems unproductive. Stillness feels suspicious, as if something important is being avoided. Confusion feels like failure instead of mystery. Even suffering takes on an added layer of pain, because it is no longer just suffering, it is evidence that the self-improvement project is not working properly. The present moment in this structure is never allowed to stand on its own. It is always evaluated by how useful it is for becoming someone else later. Experience is no longer something to be lived. It becomes raw material. Every feeling must justify itself. Every reaction must be explained, corrected, or transcended. And here is the quiet irony that often goes unnoticed. The one who wants to improve is the same one who is being improved. The judge and the judged share the same voice. The controller and the controlled are not two separate entities. They are the same movement looping back on itself. The ego is not escaping itself through self-improvement. It is reinforcing its own boundaries, mistaking activity for freedom. This is not an argument against growth, learning, or change. It is an invitation to notice the structure through which growth is being imagined. Is change allowed to happen as a natural response to life, or is it being forced through self-conflict? Is awareness allowed to observe freely, or has it been recruited into constant correction? When this structure is seen clearly, not analyzed to death, not fixed, not replaced with a better strategy, something begins to soften. The urgency eases slightly. The need to arrive somewhere loosens. Not because a solution has appeared, but because the problem has been revealed as something the mind itself has been generating. And perhaps that recognition is enough to pause here, without resolving anything, without concluding anything, simply noticing that the struggle to become better may itself be the very movement that keeps the self at war with itself. When the mind commits itself to the project of self-improvement, it also commits to a particular relationship with time. Time is no longer simply something that passes. It becomes a ladder. The present moment is a rung, not a place to stand. It exists primarily to be stepped on, used, surpassed. And once time is arranged this way, experience is subtly reorganized around anticipation rather than presence. This is why so much self-improvement language lives in the future tense. I will be calmer. I will finally feel whole. One day I'll stop reacting like this. The future becomes a psychological refuge, a place where the self imagines it will finally be safe from its own discomfort. And the present, by contrast, becomes something to endure, tolerate, or fix. Rarely something to trust. Notice how this shapes attention. The mind is never quite where it is. It is always monitoring itself from a slight distance, asking whether this moment is moving things in the right direction. Even awareness becomes forward-leaning. It does not rest. It scans. It checks. It evaluates. And what feels like discipline is often just vigilance turned inward. Here another metaphor appears, quietly and without drama. Imagine someone standing in front of their own shadow, trying to push it into a better shape. They lean left. The shadow leans left. They lean right. The shadow leans right. No matter how much effort they apply, the shadow never improves because it is not an independent thing. It is a consequence, a result of light, position, and movement. Much of what we call the self operates in this way. Moods, reactions, habits, even identities are not isolated objects that can be directly sculpted. They arise from conditions biological, psychological, social, historical. When the ego tries to reshape these outcomes directly, it is like arguing with the shadow instead of noticing the light. But the ego prefers direct control. It distrusts indirect change. It wants leverage. It wants guarantees. And so it creates increasingly refined strategies for managing itself. It adopts new concepts, new frameworks, new ways of explaining why certain thoughts should no longer appear. Each strategy promises relief, but each one also reinforces the same underlying assumption. This should not be happening if I were doing this correctly. This is where identity quietly hardens. The self no longer experiences emotions simply as emotions. It experiences them as statements about who it is becoming. Anger is no longer just anger. It is a flaw that should have been outgrown. Sadness is no longer just sadness. It is evidence of insufficient healing. Confusion is no longer a natural response to complexity. It is a personal shortcoming. As identity tightens around these interpretations, anxiety grows not as a sudden invasion, but as a background pressure. A constant sense of being behind schedule, of lagging behind one's own expectations, of needing to catch up to an imagined version of oneself that always stays slightly ahead. This anxiety often hides behind very sophisticated language. It doesn't always say, "I'm afraid." It says, "I'm just being honest with myself." It says, "I'm holding myself accountable." It says, "I don't want to settle." These statements sound virtuous, but they often function as quiet forms of self-rejection. They keep the present moment under suspicion. And yet, something important is overlooked in this entire structure. The impulse to improve arises within experience, not outside it. The desire to become better is itself a thought appearing now. It is not a command issued by some higher authority. It is another movement in consciousness, conditioned by culture, memory, comparison, and fear. When this is not noticed, the mind treats its own thoughts as instructions rather than events. A thought says, "You need to change," and the body tightens. A thought says, "You're falling behind," and the nervous system reacts as if to danger. The thought is believed, not examined. And belief turns imagination into pressure. This is why self-improvement can feel endless. Each insight creates a new standard. Each standard creates a new way to fail. The ego does not dissolve through this process. It multiplies. It fragments into versions of itself that are constantly measuring, correcting, and supervising one another. There is always a watcher watching the watcher. And this reflexive loop feels intelligent. It feels deep. It feels like awareness. But awareness itself does not strain. It does not need to supervise itself. Strain appears when awareness identifies with an image and feels responsible for maintaining it. The moment this is seen again, not solved, not fixed, not transcended, something loosens slightly. The mind begins to sense that it has been treating its own movements as enemies, that it has been trying to control effects rather than understanding causes, that it has been demanding certainty from a process that is inherently fluid. This loosening does not arrive with fireworks. There is no dramatic relief. In fact, it can feel strangely anticlimactic. The part of the mind that wanted achievement, mastery, arrival, feels disappointed. But beneath that disappointment is something quieter, a subtle reduction in resistance. Experience begins to be allowed again. Thoughts can appear without immediately being interpreted as problems. Emotions can move without being measured against progress. The present moment does not need to justify itself as a step toward something else. Change still happens. Habits still shift. Understanding still deepens. But it no longer happens against what is. It happens the way balance happens when tension is released not through effort, but through alignment. And perhaps this is the uncomfortable realization for the ego. that what it was chasing through endless improvement was never at the end of the chase. It was always closer to what happens when the chase itself relaxes. As the structure of self-improvement continues to operate, it begins to subtly rewrite how the mind understands identity itself. Identity is no longer something that appears naturally, a shifting sense of me. Arising from memory, language, and relationship, it becomes something that must be curated, maintained, kept consistent. And once identity becomes a responsibility, experience becomes a threat. This is where rigidity deepens, almost invisibly. The mind begins to say, "This is who I am now," not as a simple description, but as a quiet contract. And every thought, emotion, or reaction that does not fit that contract feels intrusive, out of place, wrong. The ego does not like surprises, especially when it has invested heavily in a particular image of progress. You can feel this when an old pattern returns unexpectedly. Perhaps irritation appears where patience was supposed to live now. Perhaps insecurity surfaces after years of working on confidence. And the reaction is not simply, "Ah, this is happening again." The reaction is, "This shouldn't be happening anymore." That single word "anymore" reveals everything. It shows that identity has been placed on a timeline, and that the present moment has failed to live up to it. Here another ordinary image can help. Imagine a person trying to hold water in their hands. The tighter they squeeze, the faster it escapes. The effort itself becomes the cause of loss. Identity, when grasped tightly, behaves in the same way. The more the ego tries to secure a stable version of itself, the more fragile that version becomes. Self-improvement often increases this fragility because it raises the stakes of inner experience. Thoughts and emotions are no longer neutral events, they become verdicts. Each reaction is silently interpreted as confirmation or contradiction of who one believes oneself to be. And living under constant internal judgment, even a gentle one, slowly drains vitality. This is where psychological tension quietly accumulates, not as a dramatic crisis, but as a persistent background strain. A sense that one must always be monitoring, adjusting, correcting. Even moments of peace feel conditional, as if they could be revoked at any time. The mind never fully rests, because resting feels like losing control. And control is the unspoken centerpiece of the self-improvement project. The ego does not merely want growth, it wants predictability. It wants to know that certain feelings will no longer arise, that certain reactions have been eliminated, that uncertainty has been resolved. But life does not operate according to contracts. It moves in rhythms, cycles, fluctuations. When the ego demands consistency from something inherently fluid, tension is unavoidable. This tension often shows up as overthinking. The mind replays situations, analyzes reactions, dissects motives. It asks endless questions, not out of curiosity, but out of fear of losing coherence. Overthinking is not the mind being too active. It is the mind trying to stabilize an image that feels perpetually at risk. And yet, notice something important here. The self that is being defended is never actually encountered directly. It is always an idea, a memory, a projection. When you look for the improved self in immediate experience, what you find instead are sensations, thoughts, emotions, perceptions, all changing, all passing. The solid self that must be perfected is never found as an object. It exists only as a story the mind keeps telling itself about itself. This is where the ego's struggle becomes particularly clear. It is fighting to protect something that is conceptual, not actual. It is expending enormous energy, defending an image that cannot be pinned down. And because the image cannot be secured, the effort never ends. This does not mean the image disappears the moment it is seen. Habits of identification do not dissolve instantly, but the relationship to them can change. The mind begins to notice that it has been confusing description with obligation, that it has been turning temporary states into permanent identities. that it has been asking experience to behave according to rules it never agreed to. As this recognition deepens, something shifts in how tension is felt. Anxiety no longer feels like a personal failure. It is seen more as a signal of resistance, a sign that the mind is trying to hold itself together too tightly. Confusion no longer feels like incompetence. It feels like an honest response to complexity. Even discomfort regains a kind of neutrality. It is no longer evidence against the self. It is simply part of being alive. Everyday life begins to look different through this lens. Work is no longer just a test of productivity or worth. It is an activity unfolding in time, with energy that rises and falls. Relationships are no longer stages on which a better self must perform. They are unpredictable encounters between changing beings. Even time itself softens. The future loses some of its authority as a judge of the present. This does not produce a dramatic sense of liberation. In fact, it can feel oddly ordinary. The ego often expects fireworks, breakthroughs, final answers. But what appears instead is a quiet decrease in inner conflict. A sense that the mind no longer needs to constantly argue with itself about what should or should not be happening. The struggle does not vanish. Thoughts still arise. Old habits still surface. But they are met with less urgency, less demand, less interpretation. And in that softer space, something subtle becomes possible. Experience is allowed to complete itself without interference. Not because it has been improved, but because it has been permitted. When the effort to improve finally loosens its grip, what becomes noticeable is not a dramatic absence, but a quiet reorientation. The mind is still there. Thoughts still appear. Preferences still arise. But the posture toward them changes. There is less leaning forward, less bracing, less trying to extract meaning from every inner movement. Experience is no longer treated as a message that must be decoded correctly. This is where a subtle shift in perception often occurs. The ego does not vanish. It does not collapse in some final moment of clarity. It simply loses its position as the manager of experience. It becomes one movement among many, rather than the authority overseeing all others. And without that authority, its conflicts lose their urgency. Notice how different this feels from self-improvement. There is no sense of arrival here. No milestone reached. No internal announcement that something has finally been resolved. In fact, the mind that was invested in progress may feel slightly disoriented. It doesn't know how to measure what is happening. There is nothing to optimize, nothing to fix, nothing to congratulate itself for. And yet, life continues to move. Thoughts still arise, but they are less sticky. Emotions still surge, but they are less personal. Identity still forms, but it is lighter, more provisional, more transparent. It begins to feel less like a solid thing that must be defended, and more like a pattern that comes and goes depending on context. This is where the deepest irony of self-improvement reveals itself. The qualities people often chase through effort, ease, clarity, authenticity, presence, do not arrive as achievements. They appear as byproducts of non-resistance. They show up when the internal argument quiets, not when it is finally won. Consider how this plays out in very ordinary moments. Walking down a street, sitting in silence, speaking to someone without rehearsing who you are supposed to be. In these moments, there is no project underway, no version of the self being updated. And yet, there is a sense of aliveness that effort never quite produced. This does not mean the mind becomes passive. Life still demands responses. Decisions are still made. Learning still happens. But these movements are no longer framed as corrections of a flawed self. They are simply responses to circumstances, shaped by understanding, habit, and care. The difference is subtle but decisive. When change is no longer driven by self-conflict, it no longer reinforces identity. There is no image to protect, no future self to defend. Action arises, happens, and dissolves back into experience without leaving behind a psychological residue. Time also begins to feel different here. the future loses some of its hypnotic pull. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer holds the promise of redemption. The present moment is no longer a means to an end. It is sufficient in itself, even when it is uncomfortable, uncertain, or incomplete. This is often misunderstood as complacency, but complacency is indifference disguised as peace. What appears here is not indifference, but intimacy with experience, a willingness to be present without negotiating terms, without demanding guarantees. And perhaps this is what the ego was unknowingly resisting all along. Not stagnation, but vulnerability. Not failure, but openness. The willingness to let experience be as it is, without turning it into a problem that must be solved in order to justify existence. From this perspective, self-improvement can be seen more gently. Not as something wrong, but as something incomplete. A sincere attempt by the mind to escape discomfort by refining its own image. A movement that makes sense, given how deeply the culture equates worth with progress. But when that movement is seen clearly not condemned, not celebrated, it no longer needs to run the show. It can arise when useful and fall away when unnecessary. It no longer defines the relationship the mind has with itself. What remains is not a better self, not a perfected identity, not a final understanding. What remains is something quieter and harder to name, a mind that is no longer at war with its own movements, an awareness that does not need to improve itself in order to allow life to happen. And in that space, improvement may still occur, habits may change, insight may deepen, patterns may soften, but none of it is carried as a personal victory or failure. It happens the way seasons change, not because something was wrong before, but because change is what life does when it is not being resisted. There is no conclusion to draw from this, no lesson to apply, no practice to adopt, only the gentle recognition that the effort to become someone else was always happening inside the same awareness that is already here. And when that recognition settles, even briefly, the struggle does not end in triumph, it simply loses its reason to continue.